Um, so with that, let me introduce Robbie Cangelosi. Robbie is a longtime member of the Friends of the Cabildo, two-time president of the Friends of the Cabildo, is the president of Koch and Wilson Architects, is a professor at Tulane in the Historic Preservation Program, um, uh, float designer for Bacchus. I mean, his list goes on, and books. Not only these books has worked on for many years, as well as the main author for three of them, but also has written books for the Archdiocese and the Bacchus organization. And I'm sure I'm missing a couple other books that Robbie you've worked on over the years. But we couldn't be happier for tonight to introduce this book to everybody. It's I know been a labor of love for you to get it done. So with that, I welcome Robbie Cangelosi to talk about Volume 9, Carrollton. Thanks, Robbie.
Thank you very much. It's hard to believe that it was 50 years ago that the Friends of the Cabildo began working on the first volume of the Lower Garden District, which was released in 1971. So next year will be the 50th anniversary of the release of the first book. Many of the early pioneers of the book have since passed away. Samuel Wilson Jr., Bernard Lemon, Mary Lou Kristovich, Dorothy Schlesinger. This book is dedicated to both Mary Lou Kristovich and Dorothy Schlesinger, who were very instrumental in beginning this book. You've got to remember that when the Friends began this, there was no Historic District Landmarks Commission. There was only the Vieux Carré Commission. When the Friends did a book, it then became a city historic district. The Lower Garden District was the first, then the Central Business District, the Creole Faubourgs, Esplanade. And as we went down, we would do a book, the city would use the information, create a historic district. Also, as an outgrowth out of this, in the Friends of the Cabildo's Building Watcher tours, which went hand in hand with the release of the books, the Preservation Resource Center was born. The Friends were very instrumental in creating a lot of the early preservation efforts, but as their mission was really to support the Louisiana State Museum and the state's heritage and culture, which architecture clearly is, they decided that a lot of the same founders of the Friends of the Cabildo founded the Preservation Resource Center. So the two organizations have a similar roots. I began working on this book 23 years ago. It's hard to believe. And many of the early people working on the book have passed away. Bernard Lemon wrote the introduction to the book. He's since passed away. The problem that developed as I began researching the book, and we were pretty far along came Katrina. My house went under 6 feet of water. A lot of the research, Bernard Lemon, who has passed away, his introduction to the book, he lived in Carrollton, his house was featured in the book. That manuscript was completely lost. A lot of the early research was lost. A lot of the Carrollton newspapers, which were housed in the basement of the library at Tulane University, were flooded. So it was almost a start over. And please keep in mind that all the people that work on this book are all volunteers. The only one paid on this book was the photographer, a professional photographer, Neil Alexander, and we were able to get a grant to cover his expense. And this is not the first professional photographer we've had for the books, but he is one of the better professional photographers that we had in working on the books. There have been a lot of people that have helped contribute to working on the book. There was Judy Bethay, who did a lot of the research, who has since passed away. Ruth Burke, the president of the Friends of the Cabildo, did a lot of the negotiations for the contract. My brother, Glenn Cangelosi, helped me with a lot of the information concerning the Civil War and the occupation of Carrollton during the period. And actually, I fled my house following Katrina, was living at his house and using his archives there. Perry Chapman has helped on the book. Linda Dawson did a lot of the original typing. Fabio Diaz, he helped in doing the map for the book and doing some of the early layouts there. Nan Fraser helped do some of the research in there. John Hoslick, who was a Tulane graduate student in historic preservation, helped on the book. Rivers Long helped us with the legal negotiations. Ann Masson and Mercedes Munster did a lot of the proofreading for the book. Avis Ogilvie gave us some of the seed money to produce the book, and her family is very tied into the history of Carrollton. Of course, Jason, our executive director, helped a great deal. We had a volunteer, Heather, who assisted on this, and she's also agreed to help work on the French Quarter book, which we've been working on for some time. And Robert Wheat had assisted us in getting some money for paying the professional photographer. So this is our 9th volume on out. When the Friends started, they originally went to neighborhoods that they didn't know anything about. People say, well, why isn't there one of the French Quarter? Why isn't there one of the Garden District? Well, those neighborhoods in the 1970s were pretty stable. A lot of these other neighborhoods, their future was in great doubt. We didn't know whether they would survive or not. So the Friends went in and recorded the information. The books have become so successful that I sit on the architecture review committee for the historic districts, and some people come in, they want to demolish their building. Well, it's a good historic building. Well, the Friends of the Cabildo did not include it in the book, so clearly it's not historic. Well, this book was, this series was never intended to capture every historic building. It was to be a sampling of the neighborhood, to focus on some of the more prominent buildings and some of the vernacular buildings in the neighborhood. Just because a building is not included in this series does not mean it's not worthy of preservation. Tonight, I'm going to give you a little of the background of what's covered in the book. We obviously can't cover everything that's in the book tonight because there's a great deal of history within the book. And so we will focus tonight on some of the key elements of the book. As most of the books have, there is, let me see here. I'm sorry, I'm not moving here. Here we go. We have a history of the area. The area which is today known as Carrollton, and we're defining Carrollton from Lower Lawn Street to the current parish line, the river back to the interstate highway, was originally given to the city's founder, Bienville, in 1719. He was really given everything upriver from what is Common Street today in the Central Business District, all the way through Jefferson Parish in there. The French government decided that to encourage further settlement, that they had to get more settlers in here. So Bienville created this very feudal system in which he leased initially to Frenchmen, then to Germans, the property in uptown New Orleans, including the area of Carrollton. By 1795, most of the Germans who were living in the Carrollton neighborhood, and Germans will be key to the development of Carrollton, moved further upriver to what we call the German coast. And then eventually, Bienville's called back to France. And when he comes back to Louisiana, he tries to reclaim his property there. And so he had these legal documents prepared. This is the map of it. It's upside down by geography, but here's the Vieux Carré. This would be the Carrollton going in here. And these are all the various people that were living in Bienville's land, which was basically all of uptown. Now, he eventually sold a portion from Common Street up to Felicity Street to the Jesuits. That became their plantation there. But he still retained title to all the property up in here. And from this survey that the French had done, it was apparent that there really was not any substantial architecture in this area. It was mostly just farmland up in there. Now, this map here begins to abstract it a little bit better. Here would be the French Quarter coming on around. Here's Audubon Park here, and here's the Carrollton neighborhood here. Eventually, Nicholas Chauvin, one of the Chauvin brothers, who's very important in the development of Jefferson Parish, will acquire it. And a man by the name of Adam, who also has this nickname, Loudun there. In 1781, John McCarthy will acquire the property, and then 1808, his heirs, Louis, Edmund, and Marie McCarthy, will acquire the property. Now, Edmund will sell out his interest and then build a plantation down, what I'll show you in a second, which was down in St. Bernard Parish. And it'll be both Louis and Marie, through the aid of her husband, which will eventually sell this property to developers. Now, here you see the map of what's known as the McCarthy Plantation. Foucher would be basically Audubon Park here, and there are other McCarthys and LeBars up in here, but this is the area which will become Carrollton. Now, during the Battle of New Orleans, General Carroll of Tennessee and General Coffee will encamp on the McCarthy Plantation. Carrollton will take its name from General Carroll, who encamped on the plantation. Carroll will get the greatest political boost following the Battle of New Orleans after Andrew Jackson. He becomes governor of Tennessee and so forth like that. And General Coffee will also be one of the men who is going to encamp in what will become the town of Carrollton there. Now, when Edmund McCarthy sold his property, his part ownership in the property to his siblings, he will build this house, which was in St. Bernard Parish, which will become Andrew Jackson's headquarters during the Battle of New Orleans. So Andrew Jackson is at Edmund McCarthy's property, and Coffee and Carroll are on the properties of his siblings in what is Carrollton today. Eventually, the two McCarthys will sell their property to the developers. There'll be Samuel Sloan, who I don't have an image of, Bernard Maroney, Lawrence Milledon, and John Slidell, from whom Slidell, Louisiana, will be named. He'll become a very important political figure. Milledon will be a developer, and I'm sure most of you heard of Bernard Maroney, whose plantation becomes Faubourg Maroney, for which one of the architectural series covers there. Now, these developers will retain a German surveyor, Mr. Zimpel, to create the plan of Carrollton in 1833. Now, what Zimpel does is that he creates super blocks. A super block was really 4 current city municipal squares. You purchase one super block, and it was up to you to put the streets through there, as you see here and here, and then to subdivide the smaller blocks, as we generally see in New Orleans today, with the key lots and the properties facing the other streets. Now, there's a real problem, because when Zimpel has the area laid out, they screwed up the survey, which will create problems down the road with streets and owners cutting property, and the city saying this is the right of way, and the owners go, no, my title says this is it. So it will create some real issues with the actual development of Carrollton. Now, there are a couple of major influences which help Carrollton to develop. Now, today I generally think of going to Carrollton down St. Charles Avenue and then turn onto Carrollton Avenue. Even though I live on Carrollton Avenue, but in the mid-city area, I always think of going the other way. Well, St. Charles didn't exist. You had the New Orleans and Carrollton Railroad, which we'll see in a second, but there was no road there. The way you got to Carrollton was you went down Common Street, which becomes Tulane Avenue. Back then, it was still all called Common. Then you went on out to Carrollton in Tulane today. Then you would cross the New Basin Canal, which you see here, and then you would go down Carrollton Avenue towards the bend of the river there. The digging of the New Basin Canal was very key in the development of Carrollton. This was to rival the Creole Carondelet Canal, and the New Basin Canal would go from Lake Pontchartrain on into about where the Superdome is today, and there'll be a turning basin there. And this was really key for the development of Carrollton, because this was one of the major ways into Carrollton, not the way we think of it today. There really wasn't a road along the river either that was very substantial there. Now, the other important factor will be the development of the New Orleans and Carrollton Railroad. This will bring access from the city of New Orleans to the town of Carrollton. It was, in fact, a railroad, as you see in the image up in here and over in here. It'll eventually become horse-drawn or mule-drawn, then eventually will become electrified, although there are several different variations of the means of transportation in that. And you had regular runs from New Orleans to Carrollton. Now, this is one of the earliest railroads in the nation, and is today the oldest continually operating rail line in the nation, even though today it is a railroad. But you could then go from the city of New Orleans on out to the Carrollton area. Now, keep in mind that New Orleans, Jefferson Parish is created out of Orleans Parish. When that's done, Felicity Street was the boundary between Orleans and Jefferson Parish. Then there was the city of Lafayette, then there was Jefferson City, then there was Carrollton. And as New Orleans took back part of Jefferson Parish, the parish seat kept moving. Eventually, it'll become into Carrollton there. But this is what really spurred New Orleans development upriver as opposed to downriver. And so this railroad is very important in bringing people to the city of Lafayette, the Jefferson City, and also to the town of Carrollton. At the end of the railroad line was this beautiful car barn designed by James Gallier. It's in this Gothic revival style, looking like a castle along the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, the oldest part of Carrollton would now be in the Mississippi River. One of the real problems where Carrollton was put in, the levee kept collapsing. And Carrollton always had failing levees. And that's really one of the major reasons why New Orleans annexed Carrollton was every time they failed in Carrollton, New Orleans flooded. And there'll be several floods which will break breaches of the levee in Carrollton, which will affect flooding in New Orleans going all the way into the French Quarter. At the end of the New Orleans and Carrollton Railroad was the Carrollton Hotel. This was considered sort of a resort area. You traveled from New Orleans on out to Carrollton, which had the Carrollton Gardens, which we'll see in a second, and they have this wonderful hotel, which was known for its food, its concerts, all the venues that took place. It was sort of a getaway. You got out of the city and you got out into the country. Now, there's been several versions of the hotel because it burned and there was a major fire there, which included the Carrollton car barn and this hotel. And so there's a couple of versions of it. And we have a good bit of the history of the developers and the operators of the Carrollton Hotel. Now, adjacent to the Carrollton Hotel were the Carrollton Gardens. And there were constantly concerts in here, you see, of the German Jaeger band in here. There's a lot of ties because most of the settlers in Carrollton will be German. So consequently, it doesn't really have that French Creole Catholic background that New Orleans had. This is more where Germans could maintain their own identity. And here you see the hotel and some of the gardens. Here's a photograph from the Historic New Orleans collection of the gardens. It's based after these gardens in New York City in here. And this, according to all the precedents, was it. Now, today, all this is in the Mississippi River. It's all gone up in there. Now, they began selling lots in Carrollton. Here are some advertisements for sale of lots. It really doesn't develop very quickly. It's very slow to develop, and I'll be showing you some maps which shows that even at the time of annexation in the 1870s, Carrollton is really not very populated. It's not until about the 1890s that the population and the development of Carrollton really began to explode. Here we have a map of Carrollton in 1885. Now, this would be the railroad line coming on down, then Carrollton Avenue coming on out to the New Basin Canal back here. Here in 1878, all these little black dots are actually the houses, and you can see this would be Claiborne Avenue back here. It doesn't even exist going through the swamps up in here. And the development is close to the river, but it's still very sparse. And here in 1880, it's a little harder to read, but you can see many of the streets aren't making it out even to Claiborne Avenue in here. It takes a while for this to be developed. And here we're in 1885 and 1894. And keep in mind, we're annexed by 1874. This is when it's part of New Orleans in here. You can see how sparsely developed Carrollton is. Now, Carrollton exists as a village in Jefferson Parish between 1833 and 1845, as a town between 1845 and 1859, and as a city between 1859 and 1874 when it's annexed to New Orleans. Now, there are different incorporations that the state was allowed. You could be a village, a town, or a city, and these are the different things that Carrollton was organized under. Carrollton was by far the most populated area in Jefferson Parish. You had Gretna, which was very small. You had other communities. You had some development along the Metairie Road. You had some development along the lake, but Carrollton was by far the most populated area. Now, Carrollton, Louisiana is not the only Carrollton we've got in the nation. We've got a whole bunch of Carrolltons: Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Mississippi, Missouri, New York, Ohio, Texas, Virginia, and Maryland again in there. So it's sometimes when you're doing research nationwide, I get very excited and I found out I'll be in the wrong city. Like I was looking for the Carrollton Hotel, searching national sources and all. Turns out, yeah, I thought I had discovered some china from the hotel that I was going to buy on eBay. Well, turned out it wasn't our Carrollton. It was a different Carrollton that was there. The various mayors of Carrollton starts off with John Hampson and Albert Bryce, seen over here in the right, is the last mayor of Carrollton who will oversee the annexation into New Orleans. These are the various mayors that we have here. This man right here, we did cover in the last book, the university section, because he has a lot of impact in the development there. And this is Henry Gogrieve in here. He was very active in the German community in the city of New Orleans, many German institutions, societies, and things such as that. Now, being an architecture book, we do get into the architecture of the area. We did go into the notarial archives and look at some of the drawings there, which we included in the book, as you see here. You'll notice here the nice parterre gardens, the formal gardens here, the federal influence coming into here and in here with the exposed red brick, the elliptical tops in here, moving to a little bit more classicism over in here in the Greek Revival style. Unfortunately, all these houses are gone, as well as these that you see here. A lot of the earliest stuff, once again, is gone because that part of Carrollton is gone. We'll see a little bit in the setting back of the levees over time. So we did go through the notarial archives and we did copy some of the images in it. This house here, I just love the little belvedere on top of it up in there. And we've got, once again, we give locations in the book for all of this architecture. Some of it is very simple and basic. There's a lot of Creole cottages. We always think of Creole cottages in the Creole faubourgs, but there was actually a lot of Creole cottages built in this particular neighborhood. Here we have some older photographs of some of the older architecture in Carrollton. We tried looking at every resource that we could possibly do there. Now, Levee Street was the commercial street of Carrollton. This is all gone now. All these buildings you're seeing here were demolished. You see some great little Greek Revival corner store in here, and here's another corner store in here. The people, when they took the land for the resetting of the levees, they went to the Louisiana Supreme Court demanding compensation for their land. Well, they came up with a very bizarre ruling in the courts. And Rivers Along helped me in finding some of these old legal cases because there's a lot of debate. We know who owned a lot of Carrollton early, but we don't know quite how they got it. And so there's a lot of legal issues in here. But the Supreme Court of Louisiana ruled that the peoples whose buildings were taken had to be compensated for the building because they didn't have the building anymore. But even though the levee is put on their property, they still owned it underneath the levee, even though they couldn't use it. And so they did not have to be compensated for the taking of their property, which, not a lawyer, but to me that seems very strange. I know I would be very upset. I do remember there were a lot of lawsuits after Katrina with the canals and taking some of the space for the rebuilding of the canals in New Orleans. But that's another whole issue up in there. We did get into a lot of the businesses of Carrollton. Lumber is a very important business in Carrollton. There was a large, the Fisher Lumber Mill. There's sort of a monument to the Fisher family at the foot of I said Canal Street, but Carrollton Avenue was called Canal Street when it was a separate city. And of course, all the street names have changed over time. They were all named for presidents and numbers. Once we annexed Carrollton, we had all the numbers in what was the city of Lafayette or the Garden District, so we couldn't do that. We couldn't have we could not have two canal streets, so the names were all changed over time there. But at the foot of Carrollton Avenue was the Fisher Lumber, and lumber along the river was very important. Here you see some of the businesses, and we do get into a lot of the businesses that were in Carrollton. We also investigated some of the businessmen that were very influential in the financial development of the town of Carrollton. I did get into some entertainment, some of the things that took place in Carrollton. Dan Rice, who was a very important entertainer in the United States in the 19th century, he was a circus clown. He was the precedent for Uncle Sam. His clown costume will be the basis for our Uncle Sam character. Um, the term jumping on the bandwagon. He had this circus bandwagon, and the only president of the United States from Louisiana, Zachary Taylor, would get on the bandwagon with Dan Rice, and the term jumping on the bandwagon came from that. Dan Rice is also the first celebrity to participate in a carnival parade. He was in the very first crew of Rex parade. So he is our first celebrity. The next real big one after that will, of course, be Louis Armstrong, before it became very commonplace for crews to have celebrities in that. But we looked at the floating palace, which came into town there. We looked at this, all these other concerts and so forth that came into Carrollton. Horse racing is also very important for the development of Carrollton. What is today the Metairie Cemetery used to be a race course. And here you see Metairie Road up in here, the cemeteries at the foot of Canal Street. This would be, you see the Canal Street is basically just a shell road up in here, coming on out to Metairie Road in here. And what is the Metairie Cemetery was a race course in there. And here's an old photograph that we have in the book. There was also another race course, which was just outside of Carrollton, going downriver, and what was Greenville down there. And that race course, we get into a little bit of the history of it. We also got into a lot of the celebrations which took place in Carrollton. Of course, there in the image is the crew of Carrollton coming off of Oak Street, turning onto Carrollton Avenue there. You see the floats still being pulled by mules. We did get into some of the descriptions of holidays that was taking place in Carrollton. We hear a lot about today of Juneteenth or whatever, where African Americans celebrate when they finally hear of the Emancipation Proclamation in Galveston, Texas. But back in the 19th century, African Americans celebrated April 30th, 1870, is the day for the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, granting African American males the right to vote. And there was a lot of literature in Carrollton and New Orleans newspapers about African Americans celebrating that particular event there. Did get into the newspapers of Carrollton. Some of them, as I said, were flooded in the basement of Tulane. Some of them are housed up at the Library of Congress. And we did get into the various newspapers, and this provided a great deal of information for us. Council meetings, what was being passed. Politics is always important in cities. We did get into a little bit more history for the Carrollton book than we have in the other books. Carrollton had all the typical municipal things that you would have. New Orleans had a lot of markets, the French market, the Poydras market, all these various markets, and Carrollton was no exception. This market was the Carrollton market. This is Dante Street up in here. That house is still standing there. And here you see the public market for the town of Carrollton. And we get into the various buildings around town, the jails and the city halls and the courthouse. Streets, there's a lot of discussion in the period literature about the development of streets and how they kept them paved. We've got a lot of historic photographs of the streets, and we found even some of the city laws that were passed about architecture and where they need to be placed and so forth. Levees are very, very important to Carrollton. Here you see a lot of the flooding in here. Here you see the African Americans working on the rebuilding of the levee in here. I happen to be on eBay and I go, wait, I know where that is. That's Carrollton there. This is the train depot over here. And so I snapped it up. They didn't know what it was. This is a very early photograph, one of the circular formats that they had in these photographs in there. And this is the levee right here for Carrollton. You see the water coming up against it there. Now, as I mentioned, the levees in Carrollton were set back multiple times. And here you see a lot of the property that was lost. Here was one lawn, then another lawn. They kept moving the levees on back here. And you notice some of the old streets, Jefferson Street, Monroe, Mary Street, and all up in here, Madison. Some streets have remained the same, but some have changed. But we did lose the older part of Carrollton to the river. Got into a lot of the churches in the neighborhood and various historic churches. This was an orphanage run by the Daughters of Charity in Carrollton. It's a Catholic church up in here, and a Protestant church over here. This is the rectory for Mata della Rosa, an early sketch for the interior, and the priest that was very instrumental in the developing of it. Actually, there's a lot of ethnic rivalry going on. When the Franco-Prussian War hit, the Germans and the French began to have fights in the church, and they're throwing out one rector, one priest, because he can't speak that language, and there's all these fights between the Catholics in the neighborhoods there. Once again, this is the Daughters of Charity that ran an orphanage. I was able to get this from the Daughters of Charity's archives up in Maryland. Railroads are important, not just the New Orleans and Carrollton Railroad from the city of New Orleans on out to the Carrollton, but there was another railroad that went from Carrollton, the Jefferson and Lake Pontchartrain Railroad. Also, the New Orleans and Carrollton Railroad was eventually chartered to go all the way on up to virtually Jackson, Mississippi, and it was to tie into another part of the network of the railroads developing in the country at the time frame. Of course, when the courthouses moved from Jefferson City on over to Carrollton, Henry Howard would design the Carrollton Courthouse, and today it's undergoing renovations as a seniors center up in that, and there's a lot of debate was what was going to happen to it. It served various functions. It was a McDonough school. Here you see an image of the school. Sam Wilson had remembered they used to do executions, hanging people. He remembered witnessing, because he lived not far away, witnessing some of the hangings that took place in the courthouse grounds there. Got into the various Carrollton schools, those for boys, those for girls, those for African Americans in the neighborhood, that was run by the city of Carrollton, as well as the various churches. Carrollton, of course, had its own cemeteries. Did not get too much into this because the Friends of the Cabildo book on the city cemeteries delved into a lot of the history of the cemetery there. During Katrina, while I was stationed at my brother is very much into Civil War history. He's on the board of Memorial Hall. I did do a lot of research into Carrollton at the time frame. These are Harper Weeke's images of Admiral Farragut's sailing upriver to seize Carrollton there. There's a lot of descriptions that we have of the fortifications on both sides of the river there. And of course, the fortifications will go all the way on up to Camp Parapet, which was actually built as a result of the Battle of New Orleans to protect the city. Various generals involved up in that. Out in what was Metairie Race Course, there was an early Confederate camp set up there where people going into the Confederate Army were encamped. And here's an early photograph of it, the camp before it becomes the cemetery there. Camp Parapet started out, this is outside of what is Carrollton today, but all this was sort of considered Carrollton. There was close to the river this powder magazine. Then there was this line of fortifications going all the way out into the swamps, and there was another building out there. Did get into a lot of the history of this, a lot of the Union generals that were stationed out there, some of the men which will become the famous African-American Buffalo Soldiers, which was organized in what is Audubon Park today, we eventually moved here to Carrollton before they will go out west. Of course, Union officials in here, there'll be Butler and other officials there. And there is this big debate at the time frame about bringing in African Americans to the Union force. And there was a lot of discussion during the period of time, whether it's appropriate or not. Eventually, they will be let on into the Union forces in here. Camp Parapet still is there in Jefferson Parish. This was a communication signal that we're able to find this image of. This is a tree in Carrollton. And from here, they communicated to a signal stations on the top of the Custom House in Canal Street. It's hard to believe, but that's what was done there. And here there were these letters being published out from Camp Parapet in Jefferson Parish there. We did delve into a lot of historic photographs. This is a very interesting photograph. This is ice on the Mississippi River in Carrollton. This particular year was very, very cold, and there were these glaciers going down the Mississippi River. You see the snow in Carrollton here and here. Some of the flooding with the young boys on the little skiff up in there. Here you're seeing there were ferries that ran from the foot of Canal Street to take you across the river there. Now, the annexation into New Orleans is very complex. It starts in 1864 towards the end of the Civil War, and it won't be until 1874 that New Orleans will annex Carrollton. The annexation of Carrollton is very tied into the political situation at the time frame. Carrollton began to annex more land than we're familiar with today, as it was taking more of Jefferson Parish. Actually, the local newspaper wrote, New Orleans better annex Carrollton before Carrollton annexes the rest of the state of Louisiana. There's a lot of debate. Some people were proposing that New Orleans dump Algiers and take all of the East Bank and give Algiers to Jefferson Parish, and Jefferson Parish gives up all the East Bank to New Orleans. Some proposals had New Orleans annexing all the way through what is today St. Charles Parish. It's this big debate. A lot of it is done in secrecy. A lot of it is done very corruptly. And Carrollton starts spending money like crazy, knowing that City of New Orleans will be stuck with all the bills. And that's in fact what did happen. There's a lot of lawsuits that are filed and so forth. It gets very complicated too, that there's this one murder case where the grand jury is impaneled in Jefferson Parish that indicts the person. Then by the time he's brought to trial, Carrollton is annexed by New Orleans, and they are claiming that since he was indicted in Jefferson Parish, he couldn't be tried in Orleans Parish. And once again, the state Supreme Court came up with a very, very bizarre ruling, in my opinion. For governmental reasons, the Carrollton was part of Orleans, but for judicial reasons, Carrollton was part of Jefferson Parish. I don't know how they come up with these rulings, but apparently they did there. We did search a lot of archives for some buildings which still stand, but some which was lost. This is Avis Ogilvy's house, a big supporter of the Friends of the Cabildo, and this is her family's house. It has been in the family for hundreds of years. Her family, the Hoys, developed what is known as Hoyville, which we address in the book. Hoy was also one of the contractors that paved Carrollton Avenue at one point in time. So we tried, once again, where really the focus is on architecture, we tried finding a lot of historic images. This is a great mission house that was on Carrollton Avenue, as were these houses now lost. This house still stands. We found the original architectural drawing, and here's an old photograph, and we have a current photograph of the house of the book. This was a cistern mill, which is right at Earhart in Carrollton Avenue on St. Charles Avenue. The waterworks over here, the Carrollton car barns here. I believe this is a lighting place here, but this began as a post office in here. And here's the Piggly Wiggly, the grocery store on Carrollton Avenue there. We searched architectural archives as well. Here is the Catholic Church, and here we have got a Protestant church. This one's on Carrollton Avenue. This one's off Carrollton Avenue. We have located and included the drawings for Notre Dame Seminary. The architect Allison Owen was a general in the American Army during the First World War, saw all these French chateaus, and gave us a French chateau here in New Orleans. These two banks right at Carrollton and Oak Street still stand, the Marine Bank and the Whitney Bank and Trust, no longer functioning as banks today, but we're able to locate those. We got into some of the residential drawings too. This is Thomas Sully's house on Carrollton Avenue. This is perhaps the best prairie style house on Ferret Street in New Orleans. We found drawings for bungalows and some more pretentious houses in the area. We found the drawings for the gates at Fontainebleau Drive. We were able to locate some of the houses, believe it or not, are stock houses from catalogs, and we'll find the precedents of some of these homes, and we're able to show, included in the book, houses that are in these architectural catalogs as then the houses it stands today. Once again, old photographs. This is where we were going to have the kickoff party to the house on the Bruno House on Carrollton Avenue. These apartments, which are still there. This house and this house are still there. This is actually the Samuel Wilson Jr. house. He grew up in the area. And I'm not sure whether that's Sam Wilson as a child there or not, but it's a family member for sure. And you see in this image here, some family members there. We were able to find some very nice interior photographs. C. Milo Williams was an architect, and his brother was very influential in the development of the area, and they took a lot of photographs. And we've got a lot of exterior and interior photographs. Quite often we concentrating on the exterior of the building because that's what we have access to, but the interiors of these buildings are just as important, and to be able to document what these look like is extremely important. Some of the flooding that was taking place in Carrollton. Here you see C. Milo Williams' house on Carrollton Avenue, and so this Gothic detailing, which is still there. Now, the bulk of the book is the rear portion of the book, which is the selective inventory. We have 1,058 structures in the book in which we document information about their construction date, the original owner, the builder, the price, if we can find it. We have only 123 from the 19th century. Remember, I said that it really does not develop until very late in the 19th and into the early 20th century. The oldest building we have documented in the book is 1845. The newest is 1950. Now, of course, there are newer houses built since 1950, but we try to document all the old houses in the neighborhood in the book. The photographs taken by Neil Alexander are spectacular. In fact, I just asked him to give me a thumb drive so that we can put these beautiful images at the State Museum archives, so we have a documentation. The images, for the most part in the book, were all shot pre-Katrina. A few of the images were reshot, but because, as I explained, the evolution of what happened in the book and so forth, most of the imagery is pre-Katrina. In fact, one person contacted me. They restored their house on Carrollton Avenue. They wanted an updated photograph. And I said, I'm sorry, the book is already at press. I can't change the photograph in the book. No matter what a wonderful job you did, it is what it is. Here we see this nice Queen Anne house with the conical roof here. Here we have the second Empire style house on St. Charles Avenue with sort of a mansard roof on the tower. We've documented the history of all these buildings in here. The old Cloverland Dairy, and the same firm that designed the Cloverland Dairy architectural firm converted it to the post office. The post office insisted on a one-story building, but preservation laws required the front to be maintained. I don't think that the umbilical cord was as successful as it could be. On Oak Street, one of the earlier buildings there, a vernacular house in here. Here we've got a little bit of Tudor revival being influenced with the cantilevering of the second floor over the first floor, the half timbering in the house there. Unfortunately, this house was lost in the aftermath of Katrina. It was burned. I was actually allowed into the city while there was still looting going on, and all sorts of things happening. And I was going down Carrollton to see what was going on there. I was dodging the trees and all. There was still gunshots going off in the neighborhood. This was the Andrew Jackson Higgins house, the man who did the boats for the landing in Normandy. Unfortunately, it's no longer with us. This has some modest prairie influence into it there. Here we have two Dutch colonial revival houses with their gambrel roofs there. Here we have some Eastlake influence going on and some late Italianate in this corner store here. Concrete block, Sears and Roebuck. We have a little bit of the history of this. Sears and Roebuck patented a concrete block machine, sometimes referred to, today we call it CMU. Back then, sometimes it's called patented stone because they had patents for this stuff. And there's a whole bunch of concrete block homes throughout the country, and New Orleans is no exception here on Claiborne Avenue. And I show one of the stock houses this is very similar to. We have a little bit of Mediterranean villa over here with the arches and the planter box and the tile roof there. The Waldo Burton Memorial. This is Mediterranean villa based on the work of Mr. Platt, an architect that specialized this nationwide. Here we have got this Italianate house here and a very vernacular house over here. We've already mentioned Notre Dame Seminary, looking like a French chateau. This property was actually owned by the Redemptorist priests, and they eventually sold it to the archdiocese there, and have a little bit of the history of how all that came about there. And of course, the Carrollton courthouse in here. This great Greek revival structure. The building specifications are actually housed in the Gretna courthouse today. They moved their archives on over to Gretna when they moved there, so the original contract is housed over there. So here you've got this Greek revival structure, and here you have a very modest shotgun in here. This we call Louisiana Colonial Revival, because they were calling Greek Revival Southern Colonial, because so many of the larger homes in the South in the antebellum period were done in this style. When they revive it, they call it Southern Colonial. Bernard Lemon used to call this Edwardian, but doing research, we know during the period this was called Southern Colonial Revival. This is the house that we saw earlier with the child sitting on there, the Williams house. No longer with us, but a gas station. It's been since demolished, and the structure is there. We have some mission in. This is mission. This is mission. This is mission. Here's a residence. This had an arch in here. It had a mission window up in here, since filled in. This was built as a drugstore. It then went to a Mexican restaurant, and then I believe it may be today a Japanese restaurant. But this was the last drugstore in New Orleans to have an active soda fountain in it there. Monte della Rosa, this Renaissance Revival church there. A very nice house on St. Charles Avenue with all the Eastlake detailing in there. This house here is very interesting. It started off as a one-story house. The original portion is the upper floor in here. They lifted the house into the air and added the ground floor and the wings to it, and this is to look like George Washington's home in Mount Vernon. And so this is Colonial Revival in style here. They gave an estate sale in there, and I got in there not to buy anything, but I wanted to see the house and to figure out what had happened. I figured out that the original portion of the house is the second floor and the first floor. And this happens a great deal, where they elevate a house and they add a first floor to it to make it look more pretentious. We do get into, because of the development of Carrollton, a lot of bungalows, lots of arts and crafts, California style, craftsman style bungalows, because a lot of this is developed during this period. We're able to document some of the inspiration from Sears and Roebuck, from Aladdin and Company, from Montgomery Ward, doing a lot of this. We got into some of the smaller churches, as you see here. This house on St. Charles Avenue, most likely, and we couldn't definitively say this, I believe this was done by H. Jordan Mackenzie, commonly known in New Orleans as Blue Roof Mackenzie, because of his house on West End Boulevard with the bright blue roof on it. Mackenzie was heavily inspired by the Austrian architect Joseph Obrecht, who was following the Austrian Secessionist style. This house originally had little men sitting on the niches, and we have an old photograph of that in the book there. This is the same guy that did the building in the French Quarter on Bienville Street that had the men sitting on the niches there. And this is one of the hallmarks of his work. A lot of details in this house are similar to Joseph Obrecht's. As I said, I couldn't definitively say this was done by Mackenzie, but all signs point to this being done by him based on the other designs he did in New Orleans. This house here on Leonidas Street, the folklore in the neighborhood was the contractor stole all of the stucco for the construction of this house from the Sewage and Water Board plant, which was built right across the street there. It was all built with stolen products from the Sewage and Water Board plant there. It's a very nice Tudor Revival house. Here we have the Second Empire style house over here with the mansard roof on it. This is another H. Jordan Mackenzie house on Carrollton Avenue with this sort of mushroom roof on the top of it there. Well, the older houses in Carrollton, this house on Oak Street here, done in the Greek Revival style. It's got sort of the Greek temple here, the box columns, and they increase the pitch of the roof. The parapet is lower than the ridge of the roof because this Greek Revival did not like seeing roofs. They don't like doing dormers. They will use attic windows instead of dormers. But because it wasn't draining too well, they actually over the years increased the pitch of the roof. And we go into a lot of the history of this particular house in the book. Some other the earlier, these are Italianate style houses in the neighborhood there. On St. Charles Avenue, some Tudor influence in here with the Tudor arch, the diamond panes of glass, the cross gabling on the house there. Some more modest houses, a little Creole cottage here, and this house here in the Riverbend area. On Carrollton Avenue, Tudor revival with all the half timbering there. Late Italianate. And this is the rear cover of the book, one of the older houses in the former town of Carrollton. This is the Bruno house today. It has the decorative verge boards here, the trifoils, the quadrifoils, the octagonal chimneys, the octagonal columns up in here. This illustration, the back cover, as well as the front cover, were both done by Jimmy Blanchard. Jimmy Blanchard did the cover for the university section book. We had to wait a little bit to get these images because they were on exhibit at the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. Jimmy agreed to let us use these images for the front and back cover, and we're very grateful for him for doing that. We couldn't really find an Ontario archive drawing like in the earlier books that said Carrollton. So actually, we were going to commission Jimmy to do this, and he says, wait, I've already got these drawings done. I'll let you use the drawings for the book. So it saved the friends some money, and I think they're quite handsome illustrations for both the front and back cover of the book. So that takes me through sort of an overview of the book. Obviously, I can't cover everything that's in the book. We really want you to acquire the book and to read the book. It is much larger than the previous books. We do have in the back illustrations of the houses as well as the history of the house. The more detailed full chains of titles will be put at the Old U.S. Mint with the rest of the research for the book series. We do have, like in the previous two books, a chart which will give the address, the owner, the builder, the architect, the date, and the cost amount, all done alphabetically by street and then numerically by address. So it's sort of a thumbnail reference in that. There's more information in that than we have in the back. Sometimes it wasn't terribly great house there, but we had the information that we had acquired through a database that the Friends of the Cabildo have created. We have entered over 80,000 entries into this database from various resources. Instead of going through the same resources over and over and over again, we got some grants, created a computerized database, and actually the people working on the Garden District book are using it. HDLC is commonly calling me for information from that database. We've got other researchers calling us all the time. And of course, when we do how to research your own property at the Old U.S. Mint, we make that available there. We're working on a grant right now to be able to put that online for people to access that database. It's a finding aid. It will tell you by address who the owner, the builder was, where it's recorded, any dollar amount, an architect if listed, but it's for you to go to the original source to see what's there, to get additional information there. So Jason, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Since we do have a lot of people on here, about 75-ish people, I do have a couple questions that people have asked on the chat, so we'll start with those. If you want to ask a question, the easiest way to do it is just put your name in the say I have a question, and I'll unmute you as we get there. So the first question, Robbie, let me go up a little bit. And just to point out, if you did want to buy the book at the discounted rate, I'm linking right now. There's a code as well as a link. Both of them work. So you can use both of those, and that'll give you the ability to purchase at a discounted rate tonight only. I think it ends at 8 p.m. So let's go to questions. All right, the first one. How long did it take to get to the Carrollton Hotel on the railroad from its origin?
Let me go back here and look at the the timetable.
I mean, how far
was
how far
about
is
a 30,
now?
40-minute ride out there. There are a lot of nice descriptions of it. In fact, they had issues. They had to put cattle guards on the cars because quite often there were accidents where they would hit cattle. We got into a lot of things about stray cattle in Carrollton, and that they picked up your cattle and held it for a while, then they sold it there because they had all these issues of loose cattle running through the area there. Let me see here. Here we go. Here's the railroad chart in here. let's see. Well, it looks like from New Orleans it was running every 2 hours, and from Carrollton it was running every 2 hours. But clearly, it didn't take you 2 hours. That's where it's the departure time during the week. These are the weekday times, and here's the Sunday times. I'm sure it's about the same time as it took you to ride on the streetcar today. I would think about a half an hour. The Friends did an architectural tour along the streetcar for the AIA convention, and I believe that's the route it took, the time it took going one way. Could be wrong on that.
So you're saying our streetcars are about as fast as the railroad back then?
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
All right, let's see what else we have in here. Wendy Lodrick asked, when were the lion sculptures installed at the entrance of Pritchard Place across from Notre Dame Seminary?
I don't know. Let's see here. Let me check on something here, give you about the time of that. Trying to find the earliest house on Pritchard to kind of see when the street developed up in there.
Yeah,
there are a lot of street gates like that were developed at the time frame, and that was a common development even as Mary began to develop, to put sort of these gates and features there. Pritchard Place, let's see. Oldest house I have documented in Pritchard Place is 1913, so I would assume about 1910 is when the street was developing. There is a dentist by the name of Dr. Gibbs, or Gibson, can't remember exactly now, that did a lot of development on Pritchard Street. He got into a whole bunch of development there, and some of the earliest houses on Pritchard were developed by Dr. Gibson.
All right. The next question is, let's see, let me back up. This was pertains to when you were talking about I believe about the lawsuits and the river. When you say part of the early Carrollton is in the river, is that because the river moved over time? Were people building houses in the Batcher, or was the levee moved farther inland to respond to flooding?
The levee was moved because it was a cut bank and the levee kept failing. So they had to keep moving it into the town of Carrollton to keep a stable levee. There was constant, throughout the history of Carrollton, that's why there's a whole section on the levees. There was a levee break in the early 1800s, as I said, flooded all the way into New Orleans there. And so it was moved to give a stable base. It wasn't that this was built on the other side of the levee. The levee was creeping in. It was moved back in order to protect the city of New Orleans and Carrollton from flooding there.
A second question we've already discussed today. It's your probably most discussed question. Is the Friends of the Cabildo plan on publishing any more New Orleans architecture books? Very quickly, I know you know the answer to that.
We have been working on the French Quarter book. Unfortunately, I don't know if I'll live long enough. I've lost several people already. Judy Pathet, Frank Masson have all passed away that were working on the book. I've got my office that's stacked full of things. We tend on doing the French Quarter book different than any of the other books, in that we were attempting to do every single parcel in the French Quarter, even if it's a parking lot, to propose to say what was on that site. The long range plan for the books, and I don't think I'll live long enough to do it all, but after this, some of the books have been kind of done by other groups. For example, the research for Bayou St. John book, a Faubourg St. John, Mary Lou Kristovich, when she knew she was passing away, came to me and says, listen, I've got all this research I did way back when we first started the series. I want the Friends to publish this. And I said, Mary Lou, I can't handle it. I'm in the throes of getting Carrollton on out. I'm working in the French Quarter book. I've got too much on my plate as a volunteer effort in here. So she went to the Louisiana Landmark Society and did that. The people in the Garden District are preparing a book that I've been kind of helping them with, but it'll only be the Garden District. The plan was to do the city of Lafayette, which would be the Garden District, Irish Channel, and Central City. There is in the Jefferson City book the long-range plan, which will include Mid-City, Algiers, the lakefront in Gentilly is the plan. Originally, keep in mind, there was only planned to be 4 books. So we're more than double that already. I don't know who will take this over in the future. I'm getting up there in age, and I'll be one of the other ones down the road that'll be part of the history of the series in there. But yes, there will be more in the series.
All right. Let's see. What is the oldest existing structure in Carrollton? Maybe present day now.
1845. I looked that up, and I can't remember now whether it's the house on Oak Street or it's the Gothic house. But it definitely 1845. I knew that question was going to come up, so I got the dates, but I didn't quite get the addresses. I had all the addresses written in a chronological, or not chronological, but construction date order. I can't tell you off the top. It'll take me a little time to look it on up there. If you get an address from them, an email address, Jason, I can respond to it and we can send them that information.
Perfect. Maybe we can include it when we send out the recording of this to people so they can.
Yeah, if people want to email addresses to the Friends office, I can respond to those because we've done other seminars on New Orleans architecture and so forth, and people subsequently had questions that they thought of down the road. They just emailed them, and I addressed them when I had a little bit more time to do that.
Yeah. And Wendy's asking that, meaning she lives on that street. Which I think a phone call to Robbie probably get you started, Wendy, to get that going.
Wendy's on Pritchard Street.
Yeah, she's on Pritchard Street. Yeah.
Does she got an address? I can probably look that up quickly.
All right, I'll let her put that in there. She can privately send that to me.
Just privately text that, and yeah, I'll look it up and I send it to her. Yeah, right. We don't want to give that information over the Zoom.
Yeah. How and when did the Hoey's acquire so much land, and who did they sell it?
They were some of the early people in there, and they acquired it. They had a plantation, which became Hoyville, and they were contractors that was doing the planking of Carrollton Avenue. So they were planters as well as contractors.
All right. There's multiple questions about Palmer Park. I don't think we talked about it too much. Do you have a little info about Palmer Park that you could talk about?
Well, Palmer Park is named for Reverend Palmer of the Presbyterian Church. He was a staunch states' rights advocate. In his sermons at First Presbyterian is what led one of the chief reasons that Louisiana seceded from the Union. New Orleans was not really in favor of leaving the Union because its ties were so close to New York and so forth in the North. The economy was there. But Palmer that's probably why the name of Palmer Park will be changed because of his pro-Confederacy stance and all, but it's named in honor of Reverend Palmer. We do have information on Palmer Park, who did the gates there and so forth in the book. Let me see if I can find that real quick.
I know there's been some discussions, including a couple people who are on today, about possibly changing the name to Earl Palmer Park for the famous drummer and studio musician. So maybe that way would keep it with the same name, possibly, if they do.
Yeah, that's up to that committee that's looking at all the name changes. Here, everything from Governor Nichols Street to a whole bunch, Tulane Avenue. They're talking about changing a lot of names. Let's see. Palmer Park. Entrance archway was designed by Carrollton architect Thomas Thompson and the city engineer William J. Hardy, and built by Frank Bixley, according to the November 22nd, 1911 contract at a cost of $1,500. Previously known as Hamilton Square, maybe we go back to the old name Hamilton Square. The park was named to honor Dr. Benjamin Morgan Palmer, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church. Dr. Palmer Avenue is named for Palmer. He's run over by the New Orleans to Carrollton Railroad, or the streetcar line, as he's crossing the street there, and they changed the name of the street in his honor there, but he was run over by the streetcar there. And we do have a little thing about Palmer Park on page 208 in the book.
All right.
206, I'm sorry.
let's see. Going back a little bit, Emily Manger writes, I'm curious about the cemetery that was located in the former Green Square, as mentioned on page 55. So she must already have her book. Where can I look to find more information about this early cemetery?
Check the Friends of the Cabildo's book on the cemeteries. There's information in the Carrollton council minutes. You can look in the Carrollton newspapers. I'm trying to think of other sources. Unfortunately, some of this was worked on so long ago, I don't remember it all. I'm sorry. Um, but there is some at the Tulane Library. There is some research, or there is some primary information on Carrollton there, and you might check there looking for the Carrollton City Council minutes, which was published in the newspapers and so forth. Some of the newspapers for Carrollton are at the Library of Congress, and you can use their website to get to some of them.
Let's see, where are we? A couple people who wish to volunteer. If they would like to volunteer, you can always just email myself, Jason at friendsofthecabildo.org, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with Robbie and whomever he's working with. What do you consider the boundaries of Carrollton as we know the area today?
Well, we define Carrollton in this book here as being the Mississippi River, um, the Interstate Highway, Lower Line Street, and Monticello, which is the parish line there. So those were the boundaries of the city, sort of what's left today. And the Interstate Highway would be the New Basin Canal. That was sort of the boundary there. Once you crossed that, you were back into Orleans Parish up in there, because Common Street or Tulane Avenue was in Orleans Parish up in there. So that's how we've defined it there. Now, there are many ways of defining this. The National Register of Historic Places defines Carrollton Historic District by one way. The City of New Orleans has the Carrollton Historic District defined as another way. I use the geographic boundaries of the old city to define what was included in the Friends book.
Someone mentioned, you had mentioned about Avis's family home at Willow and Short. Around what time did you say that house was built around?
Give me a second.
It's one of the older houses in Carrollton, though. That's what someone was kind of pointing out.
Yeah. She did provide us a lot of photographs. In fact, she gave us a copy for the bicentennial, now for the centennial of the United States. Carrollton was already annexed by New Orleans, and there was Carrollton still wrote its history there, and Avis had an original copy of that history there. Let's see. It was constructed in 1871, so it's not terribly old, but it's one of the older houses in Carrollton. In 1851, John Hoy donated this entire square to his daughter, Mary, at the time of the marriage to Edward Hall. The couple had this house built 27 years later. In 1875, the Hall sold the corner with tenements to Mary's mother, Carolyn Pierce Hoy, for $200. So the house itself is 1871. Now, by New Orleans standards, that's not that old, considering the French Quarter. By Carrollton standards, that's kind of one of the oldest surviving houses in the town of Carrollton.
Okay. Let's see. A question about Black Pearl. Was it settled by freedmen from Camp Parapet?
No, Black Pearl is a made-up name. Black Pearl was made-up name by Curtis and Davis. That was given a contract to do the assessment of his community development neighborhoods in New Orleans that might be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. They had a questionnaire. I was at LSU at the time frame they were doing this, and I know all this because I was a student working on Treme, was my thesis at LSU, and I went to meet with them to see what they were doing and so forth. And there was part of the questionnaire for the residents in the neighborhood. What do you call your neighborhood? And the African Americans in what is Black Pearl today said it's N Town, and they couldn't use such a derogatory term, so they made up the name Black Pearl. Yes, there were free people of color that lived in Carrollton, and they are addressed in the book. There was not an area that you could say like this was all African Americans. These were all free people of color. There was a law passed at one time that if a slave was granted freedom, they had to leave Carrollton. They were not allowed to stay into Carrollton, and free people of color had to prove quite often their freedom. And there's a lot about African Americans, particularly marches that they had during the Civil War, after the Civil War, and so forth for their rights that we do address in the book. But I'm not saying there was not any free people of color living in Black Pearl, but it wasn't a concentration of free people of color there. I do have in the book some statistics from census about whites, free people of color, and slaves that were in Carrollton based on census from the period.
All right. Let's see. Let me go back a little bit. A couple more questions about Palmer Park. Two things. One, was it originally a dairy farmland? And I think that's a little further down. But then also, was it also known as Hamilton Square at one time?
Yes. Yes, it was originally, when laid out, called Hamilton Square, and that part of Carrollton was a lot of dairy farms that the cows would get loose to it. The Cloverland Dairy was further on up there, but there was numerous dairies, and some of the Long family papers discuss about the dairies and so forth in there. There was part of what is Carrollton that was Marleyville. He was a free man of color that subdivided the area and tried selling it off. However, this would be about where the Cloverland Dairy is, the Waldo Burton Memorial, and so forth. It was always flooding. And so the Louisiana Supreme Court eventually declared what was Marleyville abandoned palmetto fields and gave title to the city of New Orleans because no one had ever developed it. Mr. Marley tried selling it, but nobody was interested in being in the middle of the swamps there. And there is a lot of dairy farms in that particular area that developed, yes.
The Carrollton newspapers that you said were flooded out, were any of them salvaged? What's the status of them?
The process was that you freeze them and then you dehydrate the water out of them. There is a conservation process which is done to preserve them. And yes, they were eventually worked their way back in, but it took forever for that to happen. That's how I found that some of the newspapers were up in the Library of Congress and found that source.
And you said that they're now mostly in Gretna?
No, the archives are in Gretna.
Archives, okay. So not the newspapers.
Because that was the parish seat, so the parish archives were moved. There was a debate when Carrollton was annexed where they were going to move the parish seat. Some people wanted it at Harvey Canal. Some people wanted it in Gretna. There were all these different proposals as to where it was going to go once it left Carrollton there, and that's another fight that took place.
There's a question also about was there ever a ferry on both sides of the river?
Yes, there was. I think I showed a photograph of the ferry landing in some of those old photographs. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Oh, wrong way. Sorry. Do get into some of the discussions about the ferries going back and forth across the river. But there was one of the old photographs that did show the ferry landing, which I believe I pointed out. Whoops. Here's the ferry landing right here.
There you go. Mm-hmm. What part of Carrollton is considered Pigeon Town?
I've heard that term, but I'm not sure. There was a part of Carrollton which is known as Gert Town today. There's an explanation for that. I was told by some of the residents, part of Carrollton was a garbage dump, and because of the silver cans was Silver City, but was not been able to find that terminology used. We cut the book off when Carrollton's annexed for the most part. Now the architecture we continued, but I'm not really sure about Pigeon Town.
Gotcha. Someone mentioned that is this correct? The ferry went from Oak Street to 9 Mile Point.
There were several ferries. Some went directly across the river. Some went to Nile Mountain Point. It was they went to different locations at different times.
All right. Right now that I have, this is the end of the questions. If you have any last second questions, please either say your name, put your name in there, or write it down. I'll give a second or two, but that looks like that's what we've got there. So Robbie, I appreciate your willingness to do this tonight. I thought it went great, and we've sold a pretty good amount of books tonight. So as someone says, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture about our neighborhood. I as well live in the same neighborhood as well, so it's a nice piece to have at my house as well. So
Sorry to remember all the information, but I've moved on to the French Quarter book, and my mind is filled with information from there and all. And this has been actually at the printers for over a year, so I'm sorry I couldn't answer all the questions very specifically.
It was a year for us to get this all done. So thank you so much to you for all of the effort you put in there, as well as saving it. And I thank everybody for taking part. And if you still want to buy the book, you have about 40 minutes or so to still purchase it using the link and the code. So thank you so much. Someone's mentioned suburb compliments to Sandy Baptiste tour. Yes, Sandy's tour. She's doing Carrollton tours right now for the Friends of the Cabildo around the book. We'll have 6 tours right now scheduled. We've already sold out of all 3 of the 6. So if you did want to get on the tours, we only limit them to 8 people. And we do use a headphone system so that you can socially distance. And it's a great experience. If you've ever been to Europe or certain places, they use that. We use the same exact system, and it's a great way to experience getting out in the neighborhood and doing something that we normally get to do. But, it's the year it is right now, we have to kind of do it a little bit differently. But she does a good job as well. So sign up for those tours because spots are limited. So thank you so much, Robbie. And we look forward to what your next project is.
Thanks, guys, for participating. Have a
Thank
good evening and Merry Christmas.
Thanks, Robbie.